What better way for a 58-year-old white, heterosexual, homeschooling Christian dad from Pickerington, Ohio, to begin his inaugural foray into the strange land of podcasting about faith and culture than to talk about a convent and a bunch of nuns from the 13th century, right? So yeah, let's do that. Just so I can alienate 2/3 of any potential audience I may have hoped to attract before this little audio-visual brain fart of mine even garners a single view in cyberspace. I'm Doug, by the way, and if you're still here in the next 10 seconds when this bumper music fades, you'll find yourself smack dab in the middle of my initial Waughcast. So let's see where this goes. There's this gem of a line in American journalist and author Walt Harrington's wonderful book, The Everlasting Stream, that arrested my attention the second I read it, and it hasn't let go of me since. It's in this paragraph where Harrington is talking about his father, a milkman who likes to paint landscapes in his free time, and the father is explaining to the son that there are essentially two ways that he sees the world when he paints. One is to stand back, squint, and see the landscape in a beautiful blur of colors. The other is to get down on his hands and knees and examine the flowers one petal at a time. And then comes the line that essentially will end up being the book's raison d'etre, and it's this: everything's beautiful if you look at it right. That line haunted me for days, even brought the sting of tears to my eyes the more I thought about it. I think because it's true. Everything is beautiful if one looks at it right. Everything. But here's the problem. If you spend too much time wrestling with it, as I have, the line becomes a little tricky. I mean, what does it mean to look at something right? Are we talking about adopting the right attitude or being better informed about whatever it is we're looking at? Does it have something to do with slowing down, cultivating a greater attention span, or being a tad more patient? Is it about being measured or not so quick to judge or dismiss? Is it about striving to be more cultured? Maybe all of these things to a degree. But as I spent a whole month trying to wrap my mind around the concept of what Harrington meant by looking at things right, I realized that I'd actually stumbled across something pretty important, a line of query worth pursuing, one that actually tries to get down, as Don Henley once put it, to the proverbial heart of the matter. But we'll come back to that. First, I teased the convent and a bunch of nuns, and I need to make good on that promise. Then we'll return to Harrington's quote and try to make sense of it.
Blessed is the rain that falls on me.
Okay, so the year is 1843. The place, Ebstorf, Germany, a little hamlet about an hour's drive south of Hamburg, where there stands a gorgeous collection of Gothic-style northern German brick buildings dating back to the 1400s, a collection of which centers around a monastery that dates back even further to the 1100s and has been home to an unassuming little cloister of Lutheran nuns since the Reformation. It's called the Ebstorf Abbey, and we don't know much more about this convent beyond what a few WikiWand entries and a grainy 3-minute and 30-second public relations video narrated in German on waybackmachine.com have to tell us, such as the fact that it's known for the stunning medieval stained glass windows in its choir loft, the multiple Romanesque and Gothic Virgin Mary figures in its cloisters, some dating back to the 13th and 15th centuries, and the life-size statue of St. Maurice in its narthex just outside the sanctuary. But I don't bring up the Ebstorf Abbey for any of these reasons. What I'd like to focus on is arguably its greatest treasure, a relic dating back to the mid-1200s that has captured the hearts and minds of tourists, historians, archaeologists, and simple curiosity seekers alike for centuries. It's a map, but not just any map. It's part of a classification of maps known as Mappi Mundi, or Mappi Mundi if we want to go with the conventional modern pronunciation. Either way, it's the plural of Mappa Mundi, which is basically Latin for medieval European maps of the world. And even though there's a more popular and accessible example of one of these maps on display at the Hereford Cathedral in the UK, most historians still credit the Ebstorf map as being the Hereford map superior, labeling it as the largest and most detailed specimen of a Mappi Mundi on record. And rightfully so. It was a remarkable specimen, not so much for its qualities as an actual map, which were fairly rudimentary and didn't correspond to the more informed geographical knowledge of the 14th century, but more so because of the breadth and depth of its historical scope, the detail and artistry of its storytelling. Plus, like I said, the Ebstorf map was enormous, nearly doubling the size of its Hereford counterpart in the UK. Hand-painted on 30 goatskin parchments sewn together, it measured 12 feet by 12 feet, compared to the Hereford's 5 feet by 4.5. Still, like the Hereford, it used the same medieval style template of the time, something called a T&O pattern, which essentially means that it was a biblically inspired map that divided the world into three parts. It was drawn in a huge circle with Jerusalem at its center, east located at the top, and west located at the bottom, with depictions of towns, biblical events, animals, plants, and scenes of mythology scattered throughout. And also, like other T&O medieval maps, it represented the physical world as described by 7th century Spanish scholar, theologian, and Archbishop Isidore of Seville, whom one historian once called, quote, the last scholar of the ancient world, unquote. Now, if you've been paying attention, and there will be a quiz on this material at the end of this podcast, you'll notice that I've been referring to the Ebstorf map in the past tense. Well, that's because the actual physical map doesn't exist anymore. Allied forces destroyed it in the bombing of Hanover, Germany in October of 1943 near the end of World War II. All that we have today of the original are a few black and white photos taken in 1891 and 4 commissioned reproductions on goatskin parchment created by painter and graphic artist Rudolf Waughcast around 1951, one of which is currently on display at the Ebstorf Abbey. But none of this is what interests me about the Ebstorf map, nor does any of it constitute the reason I've actually been stupid enough to feature it in my initial podcast, even naming the title of my episode after it. So why? Why mention this obscure map made over 9 centuries ago by either some English clerical statesman or a bunch of Benedictine nuns? Well, to explain that, I need to draw your attention to the map itself, to what I believe to be its most telling and salient feature. What sets the Ebstorf map apart from the Hereford and others from its time period is the conspicuous depiction of Christ. Not just as one of dozens of seemingly disparate entries buried in the map's vast sea of footnote illustrations like some medieval version of Where's Waldo, but rather as the map's most prominent element, its cornerstone. In fact, when one first looks at the map, it's likely to be the first thing he or she notices. How Christ's head is depicted at the top of the map, with his nail-scarred hands appearing on either side and his blood-stained feet at the bottom. Collectively, the head, hands, and feet of Christ frame the entire circle of the map, with everything else subordinated to it. It's as though all of the other events, people, and locations depicted on the map flow through it, are ordered by it, only exist because of it. It's as though nothing presented in this vast tapestry of recorded history makes any sense apart from the divine entity that encloses it all. I like how historian Gudrun Pisch describes it in her comprehensive article, The Ebstorf Map, Tradition and Contents of a Medieval Picture of the World. There's a mouthful. Where she says, quote, in the map, the earth forms Christ's body. On top in the east, there is his head. On the left in the north, and on the right in the south, there is one hand each, one hand showing a stigma, and at the bottom in the west, there are his feet. Sicily, heart-shaped and placed on the right, slightly below the center, can be interpreted as Christ's heart. This means that Jesus Christ keeps the world together and is part of this world, like humankind whom he rules in eternity. And the world is part of Christ as his body, unquote. So in some weird way, dare I say it, all of the map's 2,345 entries, consisting of 1,500 pieces of text and 845 pictures of various people, animals, buildings, islands, and bodies of water, have throughout time and history collectively borne witness to Solomon's lament in Ecclesiastes 1 of the Bible, which he sums up in verses 13 and 14 when he says, quote, I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. I have seen all the things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind, unquote. Which, of course, is true until God sends his only son in the New Testament to fulfill the law and redeem his creation, right? When Christ serves as a necessary propitiation for the sins of the world, the end result of which is that now when God looks down on the mess that man daily makes of humanity still, he sees only the head, hands, feet, and sacrifice of his beautiful boy. And it forestalls his wrath.
Welcome in love. I know you don't know me. Take my hand. There's a lot you can show me.
Okay, bearing in mind the aforementioned, I'd like to visit some recent scholarship surrounding the Ebstorf map that comes to us compliments of the British Library, who teamed up with a London-based visual effects academy called Escape Studios in 2022 to create an interactive Ebstorf map experience called Alexander the Great, The Making of a Myth. It's actually quite remarkable. They essentially created a 3D version of the map based on a digital reproduction generated in 2008 by Leuphana University of Lüneburg, Germany. And what's interesting about this map is that it features multiple clickable points of interest, each of which, when selected, causes a small 3D model to pop up with text and a voice recording presenting details about its particular depicted person or event. And what's especially impressive is the fact that each of these clickable points of interest was painstakingly modeled after the same style of artwork featured in the original map. But that's not why I bring up this information. I bring it up because none of the 3D map's clickable points relate to Christ or the map's many prominently depicted stories from the Bible. Rather, they reference 15 of the original map's 17 illustrations that depict Alexander the Great and stories from the Alexander romance. Now, I'm not accusing either the British Library or Escape Studios of downplaying the map's historical link to Christianity, as there's plenty of room under the proverbial umbrella to delve into the map's vast array of intriguing references that aren't explicitly Christian. I mean, Alexander was great, and he did accomplish some pretty impressive things, all before the age of 32, no less. So no problem with that. God can be God, and man can still build and achieve. The two actions aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So we'll just assume that by calling its article describing the new interactive project Reimagining the Ebstorf Map, the British Library was merely wanting folks to recognize some of the map's lesser, yet nonetheless intriguing points of interest, and not suggesting that we disregard all the other ways by which we've examined the map to date. In fact, let's go ahead and tie Alexander the Great into this podcast, if only to prove the point that I made earlier and that Solomon originally raised in Ecclesiastes 1, that all of the sweat and toil of man, all of his assets and liabilities, all of his greatest triumphs and worst failings are but imperfect and incidental markings on a grander canvas, perpetually overshadowed by the person and sacrifice of Christ. That every single individual, animal, place, and event depicted in the Ebstorf map, regardless of its seemingly self-contained and autonomous meaning, ultimately points to a larger context that it serves and upholds. To illustrate this, I want you to listen to the payoff of one of my favorite sermons of all time, a message delivered by Dr. Monty E. Wilson to the congregation of Tampa Covenant Church on November 3rd, 1996. It's entitled The Sword of the Lord in Gideon. Wilson shows us how even the impressive historical icon of Alexander, as great as he may have been, ultimately points us to something greater still, symbolically moving us from the Ebstorf map's dense interior ethnography to the larger-than-life divine border encompassing its outer edges. You won't find any mention of God or Jesus in the account itself that Wilson relates, but when he ultimately moves past the story and illustrates how it spoke to him as a Christian, the connection, while metaphorical, couldn't be more obvious. And if I'm permitted to inject my own opinion here, with no disrespect to the British Library or Escape Studios, I think that the comparative leap Wilson makes in this clip linking Alexander the Great to a larger issue of faith falls more in line with the original intention of the Ebstorf map's creator. In fact, as you listen, I want you to imagine the head, hands, and feet that frame and contain all of the smaller elements of the Ebstorf map, including Alexander the Great. It's cut 7, Jake. No, it's not. It's cut 1. It's the only cut I have. I've always wanted to say that. Here, have a listen.
When I was a child, my father was always, I'm sure he thought it was a waste of time, or became very frustrated with me. He was always giving me books to read, hoping that, you know, I might one day actually learn something and get something into this head. And he did discover that I loved biographies. And so that's what he started feeding me, all kinds of biographies on great men of God and scientists and sports figures, just anything. If he's reading it, give it to him. You know, maybe one day. And I remember one of the first stories I read in Plutarch's Lives was of a true story in the time of Alexander the Great. There was this boy, as with many of the boys in Alexander's time, who could not wait to be part of the great armies of Alexander. And so he trained as a little boy, even though he wasn't old enough to go boot camp, he trained all the time. He with a stick, just like any boy will. They find a stick, it's a gun, it's a weapon. Today it might be a laser weapon, but nevertheless, it is a weapon. And he's out there playing like all boys and dreaming of being part of Alexander's army. And finally, the great day comes when he is able to go to boot camp and he trains and trains and trains and trains and using the sword and the spear and learning to fight from horseback and learning to fight with the dogs, because Alexander used dogs quite often in his battles. And finally, his first opportunity to fight comes, and he's allowed to go on the battlefield. And he is so excited, he just can't stand it. He's going to go out there and he's going to be part of the glory of Alexander. And he gets out there and he sees a friend killed, and he runs. And he runs the other direction as fast and as hard as he possibly can. And they find him hours later after the battle, under his shield, just weeping in anguish. Alexander later that evening has all of his generals together, and they are assessing the war. And one of his men says, "We had someone today turn and run in the face of battle. Now that's punishable by death." And so Alexander was livid and called for them to find that boy and get him into his tent. And they've drugged the boy, and the boy, of course, is sobbing and lying on the ground and won't even look at Alexander. And Alexander asks him his name. And the boy can't even talk. He's sobbing so hard. He says, "Son, tell me your name." And he keeps sobbing. Alexander finally is just livid and picks him up and stands him up like a man and says, "Son, what is your name?" And he said, "My name is Alexander." Alexander steps back and looks at him. It's okay. Change your name or change your behavior, and let him go. I remember reading that, and I was at a very vulnerable place in my Christian life, very going back and forth. And man, it was like God just spoke to me. Change your name or change your behavior. Quit calling yourself a Christian or act like one. Quit calling yourself a Christian soldier, a believer, a disciple of Christ, and yet refusing to put on the battle gear and take up the sword of the Lord and go out and engage the enemy.
And that, my friends, is what arrests my attention about the Ebstorf map. The idea that nothing, and I mean nothing, makes any sense apart from a deeper understanding of the historical figure of Jesus the Christ. That is, both the map and the sermon excerpt I just played attest, not even the legendary coolness of someone like Alexander the Great can provide us a satisfactory explanation of the human condition. And therein lies the lesson of the Ebstorf map, at least to me. That if we as human beings with souls that have the capacity to reason and love, and that unfortunately have the propensity to hate and destroy, ever hope to make it through this crazy, stupid pittance of finite days that, as the good book says, pass like a vapor, if we ever hope to live with any sense of freedom from fear, ever hope to see through a glass even darkly, or ever hope to experience anything close to wholeness or completeness, we need to start sifting everything we see, hear, and touch through the eternal filter. Need to return the normal to the sacred. Need to learn how to occupy and negotiate this crazy, beautiful, tragic, broken world around us. Because apart from that filter, as I've already said, all is vanity. All is lost. Okay, so finally, let's return to Harrington and the quote that so arrested my attention in the everlasting stream and put this initial Waughcast to bed. One of the most precious moments in the novel is an incidental scene tacked onto the very end of the chapter entitled Skunk Hollow. It's on page 147, and it's a pivotal moment in the book, where in sharing the memory he hopes his own son Matt will have of his milkman turned landscape painter grandfather, Harrington offers us one last flickering memory of his dad. Here's what I hope is my father's lasting memory for Matt. When Matt was a boy, he, my father, and I were driving through California's lush Imperial Valley. As we traveled, my dad told us all about gravity irrigation systems. He was so excited when we came upon old King Solomon, the first date tree imported to California, that we had to stop to see it. He told us the names of countless cacti and grasses, that hornets don't fly at night and that ants don't eat fish. In the desert, he pulled over and made us get out of his van to admire a stunning sand dune. "Look over there," he said, pointing past the dune. "Look at that lonesome mountain." Matt and I looked, and indeed, way off, A craggy ridge rose from the flat horizon like a hopeful, noisy effort against the dominant, muffling sky. We were quiet until my father spoke the words I had heard so often as a boy. Everything's beautiful if you look at it right. Note Harrington's diction here. Lonesome mountain, craggy ridge, hopeful, noisy effort against the dominant, muffling sky. That's all of us, isn't it? Lonely, craggy, hopeful yet noisy and often defiant in our exasperated and expectant upward stare into the vast expanse of the sky above us, usually complaining, questioning, demanding some sense of peace or understanding from this eternal maker who too often seems indifferent to our insistence, our grumbling. Is it a tragic picture of deluded man seeking order amidst a random chaos? Or is it man, even in the midst of anger, actually being closer to the divine than ever in his apparent suffering? Don't know. Depends on how you look at it, I guess. To me, it's beautiful. I guess because I'm finally looking at it right.
It's a sign of the times that your love for me is getting so much stronger.
Okay, so at this point, after all this, I'm pretty sure that you're sitting there thinking, who in the flaming misfortune of hell do you think you are, sitting there laboring under the delusion that you have anything close to the cred, celebrity, or physical presence to make people want to listen to anything you have to say? Well, I figured I'd better address that. Here's my qualification for turning this little audiovisual experiment loose in the cyberspace. Ready? Ready? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There. That's what qualifies me. I'm a worthless piece of unadulterated shite, as our good friends on the other side of the pond like to say, a malformed, incidental sliver of driftwood floating on the great sea of anonymity. And I labor under no delusion other than the one that daily reminds me of how insignificant and inconsequential I am. But I do have one thing going for me. I've stumbled onto the Ebstorf map, and I've weighed its profound implications. Not really the Ebstorf map itself per se, but the charged symbol that it's represented throughout history. The inevitable and epiphonic divine idea at its core. The one and only idea in all of recorded history that anyone should give a damn about. The one and only idea in all of recorded history that can truly be labeled as revolutionary. And the fact that I've had the courage to pursue this grand idea and see where it takes me is my only defense for why I'm here. That's all that qualifies me to sit here in this gloriously pathetic excuse of a studio that is my shoebox of a family room. And if you haven't been listening up to this point, or you're one of those people who simply doesn't have the attention span to stick with a video that's longer than 2 minutes, I'll repeat my reason for dumping this podcast onto your cyber doorstep. For sitting here telling you about an old relic from the 13th century and some obscure quote from a book I like. It's because both of these things ultimately point us back to him who constitutes the eternal filter. To him who ultimately helps us make sense of all things and see even the ugly as beautiful. He's the man in the Ebstorf map. You know, the guy who's got the whole world in his hands, in this context, literally. He's the big honking pair of Buddy Holly horn rims through which we behold lonesome crags pawing at the night sky. And I want to put on these glasses every day. I want to take another look at this ridiculously bizarre and fascinating world around me. All of it. Seeing what it looks like through the lens of him whose head, face, and hands made it all possible in the first place. So again, hello, I'm Doug, and congratulations, you've officially endured my initial Waughcast. The first installment in a series of audio essays that I'm essentially recording for Jack and Jake, my sons, but I'm going to be a little less disingenuous than Ben Franklin was when he wrote his autobiography and confess that I'm hoping that others, including you, will come along for the ride. Initially, I wanted to give Jack and Jake small pieces of myself to remember me by. I don't know. Maybe to help fill the terrifying blackness around them during their inevitably forthcoming dark nights of the soul. You know, when I'm no longer around to hold them, to tell them I love them, to whisper over and over again to them until it sinks in that all is not lost and this too shall pass. I mean, I have pieces of my dad like that. The actual hammer he built our house with. An Indian head belt buckle he carved out of wood when he was 16. A handful of sermons recorded on Sertron cassettes with an old Panasonic tape deck. a video interview my sons recorded with him just before he passed. Glorious, all of it. And I'm eternally grateful for every last piece. Collectively, the bits I have left of my dad have stilled my beating heart and quelled some of my most anxious moments, have spoken peace and healing to me when I've needed a gentle answer from the cosmos to turn away wrath and get me through the night. And I want to pay it forward, do the same for Jack and Jake. But like I said, if I can reach a broader audience with my musings and speak peace and goodwill to a few folks along the way, I'm okay with that. But I won't be disappointed if it doesn't happen. So here we go. Herein begins my contribution to the war effort, for better or for worse. We'll see where this goes and for how long, and you're welcome to listen into as little or as much as you can stand. Although it's going to become painfully obvious quickly that my thoughts will invariably end up beating the same drum, broaching the same theme. That we're a broken people in need of an introduction to the face, hands, and feet of this guy in the Ebstorf map. This guy who holds the key to everything we're hoping to get out of this life. Every answer to every single question that matters, if we can just get over ourselves long enough to hear his message.